Good morning, and thank you. It's really an honor to be here at the launch of Sembang Ilmu Plus. You know, whenever I travel overseas, people I would strike up a conversation with, whether at the airport or during my trip, would naturally ask what I do. At this point, I usually pause. I could say I'm a teacher, a writer, a photographer, a producer, all legitimate professions I've worked at or currently work in. But sometimes I say I write poetry, because that is far more interesting in terms of what happens next. Usually they want to read my work somewhere online, or they ask where they can buy my books, and I'm more than happy to share. In fact, last year, I was in transit in Hong Kong on my way to the US, and because the directions were so confusing, I got talking to someone so that we could figure it out. Long story short, when we stepped off the plane in SF, I had written a poem about the brief conversation we had. It was a poem about travel, about liminal spaces and the transit lounge of the pandemic. Maybe it's about being elsewhere, but poetry has that simple power to speak to individual lives, to reflect and put a finger gently on the pulse of a moment. However, if I am asked that same question in Singapore, I rarely respond with poet. Why? Because the first thing that people will say is, poet? Really? Can earn a living? How many books you sell? Singapore got people read poetry? And the answer is usually that poetry sits in an adjacent space to everything else I do. It is as important. It's the sidecar on my scooter. Will I be able to function without it? Sure. Is it aesthetic? Yeah. What benefits do I get from a sidecar? I do get quite a lot of benefits, actually. But no analogy is perfect. But poetry remains a channel for me, something that is outside the need to commodify or place a monetary value on everything. Marc, a poet and professor at Loyola University, has offered this notion. Like no other book, a book of poems presents itself not as a thing for the marketplace, but as a thing for its own sake. So immediately the poet sits outside the governing ethos of our insatiable consumerist lifestyles. And perhaps that could be extended to the artist and the artist's place in society. Well, what do I mean by that? Let me begin with a digression on the topic for today. Art for/in society. We need to perhaps deconstruct this seemingly innocuous phrase to better understand our position as artists and supporters of the art in Singapore. So, a definition. What is art? Art is a process by which human beings express an idea or emotion through a diverse range of activities that create artifacts across a range of mediums. It involves imaginative or technical skills stemming from human agency and creation, which is filtered through personal experience and set against a broader cultural context, which often reflects the human condition. And I suppose this leads us to the /for/in. The slash intrigues me. Why this slash? Is it a mutually exchangeable site of discourse, for/in? One implies that society is the endpoint of artistic creation and expression. The other implicates the world that the art is made in. And society is a general, almost generic word. We don't have one society anymore. We are tribes, split by interest, by political will, by age, by faith, by online and offline interactions. The role, work, and purpose of art is different for each of these groups. It is too simplistic to think of society as a cogent whole. It would be better for us to realize that in an age of digital integration, we are more apart than ever. This has been aggravated by, but not solely caused by, the pandemic. As a society, we have been practicing social distancing in various forms for a long time. But I want to reinforce the importance of the artist as a work in progress, as a dirty mirror. We would like a clean mirror, of course, a polished surface that reflects all the merits of society, a mirror that is not cracked or stained, a mirror that could even come with a money-back guarantee, which does take us back to the fundamental question: what is art? The idea of art and the label of artist is very broad today. Indeed, anyone who says they are an artist is an artist. But what kind of art do you produce, I ask? And more importantly, why do you produce it? Do artists see themselves as creating for the sake of creation, for aesthetic experience or contemplation, for beauty, or because you want to mint an NFT and make $1 million by the time you're 18? Again, these are noble, aspirational goals, but they will come up, as they always have, against the economic imperative to produce something of value, something marketable, which is in a way synonymous with our country. We are Singapore Incorporated. We have a product to sell, a brand to protect. Rohini Singh, Assistant Professor of Communication Studies at the College of Worcester, writes that by constructing the nation as bound by economic concerns rather than socio-political ones, Singapore is engaging in neoliberal rhetoric. Neoliberalism is a philosophy that attempts to apply the logic of the market to other institutions, such as the government. In other words, under neoliberalism, governments are seen as offering a product or service to the citizens, and citizens are treated as shareholders in a corporate nation. If this is so, we must think about the place and purpose of art and artists in an economically driven nation. Do artists also need KPIs? Do artists also need to upgrade their artistic practice every year? Should they be creating larger and larger works, publishing more and more books? Of course not. Art isn't a numbers game. In fact, art is meant as a cohesive force for good in society. And yet, corporate patronage remains low. Rates for teaching artists have not risen much over the years. And the number of students taking literature in schools continue to fall. But still, we churn out arts management students from tertiary institutions. And the question is, how many go on to work in the arts industry? How many do we need? What's the ratio of arts managers to artists? More critically, how many artists can afford to practice full-time? So many, and I speak from personal experience, so many artists engage with the arts adjacent to their bread and butter jobs, whether it's in teaching or something else. The NAC is preparing to launch the SG Arts Plan 2.0, which will run from 2023 to 2027, and I've been involved in consultative sessions with them. The aim is how can we make the arts a fundamental part of our lives and advocate its value to our society. The various intended outcomes include sustaining access to the arts for everyone through their lives, building community through the arts, and driving interest in and advocacy for the arts. These are very good goals, but they still will come up against our neoliberal logic. And the question is, how do we work within this system? For me, I continue to write poetry. It is a response that does not seek to offer a didactic or moral conclusion, but it does broadly sit within film critic Emerson Goo's assertion that the continuity of human existence is renewed by and is contingent on a vernacular knowledge of nature. This ability to speak, think, and be in the language of nature is fundamental in situating ourselves within the natural world. It's not just about forests and oceans, but about lived relationships between people, a state of continued renewal in the fundamental beliefs of human nature. We are, after all, natural beings. Dana Cloud, a cultural theory professor, writes that words do things with us in systematic, power-laden, and economic ways. And poetry is that condensed ability to express thought that sits at the intersection of narrative, imagery, and personal expression. It emanates from society. It expresses who we are, how we are, and why we are. In doing research into folklore and traditional methods of healing and spiritual practice in the region, I read about Bukit Kasih, the Hill of Love, which is found in Manado in North Sulawesi, Indonesia. It's more of a tourist attraction than anything, but it's also an important site for the Minahasa, the indigenous folk of the area. So on the top of Bukit Kasih are 5 houses of worship: a Catholic church, a Christian church, a Buddhist temple, a mosque, and a Hindu temple. While just beneath the peak, the faces of Toa and Lumimut, ancestors of the Minahasa tribe, are carved into the hillside. Kase is rooted in the basic philosophical concept of Minahasa, which is called Tomu To, Tomou, Tou, an attitude of mindfulness of oneself and a love of humanity and the surrounding environment. It is the idea of coexistence, of allowing space for art to dwell with and within us. And that is at the heart of Bukit Kaseh. Jeanette Winterson, one of my favorite authors, echoes the sentiment very well. What art does is to coax us away from the mechanical and toward the miraculous. The so-called uselessness of art is a clue to its transforming power. Art is not part of the machine. Art asks us to think differently, see differently, hear differently, and ultimately to act differently. And that is why art has moral force. Art reflects the hybrid identity present in all of us. We are not simply the product of economic process or KPIs. We are so much more than that. So in closing, I would like to leave you with homework. No, I'm kidding. With just some questions. It's the teacher in me cannot let go of that. I'd like to leave you with some questions to think about when you next encounter a work of art. And this can be in any form. First of all, what happens when we experience a work of art? Can you articulate that? Secondly, what are your perceptual, emotional, and cognitive processes when we respond to art? Thirdly, what is common about your experiences across different forms of art, and what is distinct? And lastly, how can art be part of our identity? Now, these are big questions, but they are also questions that help us think a bit more critically by reflecting on what we see so that we don't just consume at the surface level, but we learn to respond to what the artist and the work of art is saying. And finally, for the artists amongst us, let us dare to tell our countrymen, here, take my hands and hold me up to the light. I'll be your mirror. Thank you.